مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. نعرف جميعا الشعار الذي تبناه الرئيس ترامب لوصف سياساته الخارجية، أميركا أولا، ونعرف جميعا القرارات الكبرى التي اتخذها على مدار العامين الماضيين، من إلغاء اتفاقات تجارية واتفاق إيران النووي واتفاقية نزع السلاح مع روسيا، وصولا إلى التواصل غير المسبوق مع كوريا الشمالية، ومبادرة كبرى لاستعادة الديمقراطية في فنزويلا. ما معنى أمريكا أولا حقا؟ المشاركة أم الانعزال؟ أم أن شعار أمريكا أولا يحمل معنى أخرى؟ لمناقشة أفكار السياسة الخارجية الأميركية واستراتيجيتها في عهد إدارة ترامب، يسرني أن أرحب بواحد من أكثر خبراء الأمن القومي احتراما في واشنطن، وهو جيمس كارافانو. Welcome back to داخل Washington. American foreign policy is going through great changes and great debates. And to help decipher the changes in the debates, I'm delighted to welcome James J. Carafano. Jim, welcome to Dakhel, Washington.
Well, I'm not sure we're going through great debates. There actually might be more continuity and tradition in American foreign policy than people recognize.
Excellent. All right, so let me ask you first. America first, the president's slogan that covers foreign policy and national security. In a practical sense, how does that translate to what America is doing around the world?
I think it's actually a mark of traditionalism. I think initially a lot of the concern and confusion was the adaptation of that bumper sticker also happens to be the title of a very formidable political movement before World War II, which is essentially a movement to keep America out of World War II, essentially isolationism. And so I think initially, since President Trump had no foreign policy experience and no real track record to speak of, people associated his declaration of America First with kind of the isolationism of Charles Lindbergh and the other leaders of the American First movement prior to World War II. If you actually, like with many things, President Trump, if you just get beyond the very over-the-top rhetoric and the very non-traditional approach to statecraft and just kind of objectively look at the policy, what the president means by America First was, and he's actually said it several times, my job as a president of the United States is to put the interests of American citizens and the American nation first when he makes decisions. That actually is probably an unremarkable statement from almost every world leader, that it's my job to look after the interests of my people. Why people, I think, fret somewhat on that is America is just not a country like everybody else. And what does it mean for America operating in its self-interests? Because America is a global power with global interests. Well, since we're a fact that we're a global power with global interests, it also means that we have friendships and relationships and responsibilities all over the globe that as part of looking after ourselves, we have to be responsible for. So, for example, if I'm a European leader and I hear America First, that's actually good news for me because one of America's vital interests is a prosperous, stable, and peaceful Western Europe. So America First means actually a commitment to our European allies. I think in the Middle East, for example, excuse me, a peaceful and stable Middle East is an American interest. And so if I'm a Middle East leader, that statement basically says America's not disengaging from the Middle East. If anything, the opposite. America's going to be made engaged because it's in America's interest to see that relationship.
So you see America First as more of a line of continuity than a new direction for American foreign policy?
I think that's right. I think the president was trying to make a distinction. I mean, we do have this kind of debate, and I'm sure other countries do as well, kind of between national self-interest and values and what's often called globalists or globalism, right? That the responsibility of leaders transcends their leadership of the state. They should be really looking after the welfare of the entire globe and of all peoples, and they make their decisions. Those ideas aren't necessarily incompatible, but and being a realist, I mean, we often believe is if you're doing what's in your best interest, you are doing good things, and that's really what's in the best interest for all. But one nation can't be the world's policeman. We can't be the world's decider. We can't be the world's babysitter. So in a sense, America can't make the world safe for the world, but being a responsible actor and acting in its own interests actually does have an effect of making the world a better place. And I actually think we've seen that. And again, getting beyond the rhetoric, if you go around the world, in Europe, for example, I think there is recognition among European leaders, for example, that the United States is not abandoning NATO. We are being strong in pushing back against Russia's destabilizing influence. In the Middle East, we're not disengaging and walking away. We are meeting our responsibilities about being a partner in the region with our allies. In Asia, you actually see, I think, much more appreciation that the United States is present in the region, dealing with the destabilizing rise of China, actually a better partner than we were under the last administration.
So when I was referring at my opening to debates and shifts and changes, one of these is the idea in the new national security strategy that we need to move away from a focus on the post 9/11 focus on counterterrorism and sub-state actors to a focus on major adversaries, states, China, Russia, and what that shift does to our national security strategy.
Well, like all the national security strategies, there's a bit of both change and continuity in there. Part of when President Bush framed the battle against transnational terrorism as the war on terrorism, right? And really kind of interpreted it as kind of a global conflict. It's not like the United States abandoned completely worrying about Russia and China and other. It was trying to emphasize, well, this is also an important role. So even there, that was changed because we never really put transnational terrorism at the top of the list of things we cared about. But it wasn't like that we stopped doing great power competition. And conversely, I think the president's statement that we're moving back to focusing on great power competition does not mean that we're abandoning dealing with the phenomenon of transnational terrorism and global terrorism. Then we're going to just stop doing that because we're not. It is, though, a shift in balance saying, but we do need to pay attention to our significant global relations. What's really interesting, and this gets no press coverage and no discussion at all, is if you ask Bush, what's your bad guy list, right? He would say China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and transnational terrorism. If you asked Obama, hey, what's your bad guy list? He would say North Korea, China, Russia, Iran, and transnational terrorism. If you asked Bush or looked at the national security strategy, what's the bad guy list? It's exactly the same. Now, their strategies for dealing with them are different. That's the change. But there is continuity in terms of the United States looking out and saying, what are the great threats to global stability in the world today, which are most likely to conflict with U.S. interests?
Mm-hmm. So even if this is just a change in emphasis, not a change in fundamentals, how does this change translate into practical security measures, into deployments, into spending, things that people can see?
Yeah, I think that's really, really a great question. One is, I actually think in terms of retrenchment and withdrawal, you could argue the last administration was more focused on that than this administration. If you are, in a sense, saying that America first means I'm going to go out there and I'm going to protect and defend and stand up for my interests. And we talked about the critical parts of the world where that's really most important. Europe, the Middle East, and the Asia Pacific, because those are the parts of the world that really knit the whole planet together. Then that means you've got to be forward present and visible in all three parts of the world. You couldn't sustain that on the defense budgets we had in the last administration. You could make a caricature of this, and I think if the Trump guys would, and they say, well, the problem with Bush was after 9/11, Bush said, how can people come to America's soil and do this? This is horrible. We need to go out and make the world safe for America. We're the world's lone superpower. We have all the power. Let's go out and fix all the problems. And the argument would be, you spent a lot of money, you went around the world, you did a lot of stuff, you created as many problems as you solved. We're no better off than when we started. That's a criticism that I think the Obama administration would actually share. But the Trump team would say, well, they did exactly the opposite. Rather than trying to fix the world's problems, they try to run away from the world's problems. give the North Koreans what they want, give the Iranians what they want, give the and withdraw, right? And they would say, well, the problem with that is you could create gaps in space for bad guys to fill in and do bad things. And they said, we want to be the guys in the middle. We don't want to change the world. We're not interested in regime change. We're not interested in starting wars. We're not interested in building nations, things which were, I think, largely associated with the Bush administration. But we're also not interested in just getting a deal for the sake of the deal to say, I got something, and then turning your backing and walking away from a problem. So we intend to be forward president to demonstrate our willingness to defend our interests. But this, I think, is where Trump comes in, is since he doesn't see these political competitions with Russia and China and Iran as Manichaean battles of, survival and destruction like the Cold War. This isn't like these guys are an evil empire and until they vanish from the earth, I'm never safe. He sees it as we have interests, they have interests. As long as our interests don't conflict, what do I care? So if you look at all the major competitions, whether it is Putin in Europe or Iran or North Korea, even in what we're seeing in the Taliban, he offers the other guy an off-ramp. He said, look, I'm going to pony up the resources to show I'm willing to demonstrate to protect my interests. But then if you want to negotiate and you accept, my equities, that things are important to me, let's cut a deal. So, if, I think he's been most vociferous about that, about Russia, about, we could have a great relationship with Russia if only the Russians would stop being the Russians. In Iran, if you listen to the speech when the president withdrew from the Iran deal, the Joint Comprehensive
the nuclear program,
JCPOA. At the end of the speech, he said, hey, if the Iranians want to come back and do a real deal that recognizes our serious concerns and addresses them, let's do it.
So this is the transactional president.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's transactional, because transactional makes it sound like it's kind of a straight costs and benefits arrangement where, as long as I'm 50 cents ahead, I'm happy. It's a little different here because remember, he said America first. My job is to protect America's interests. So he's not going to cut a deal that he thinks would compromise on America's interests. But beyond that, as long as that equity is recognized and somebody's willing to make a deal, he makes a deal. So every element of Trumpian foreign policy kind of includes an off-ramp.
Very interesting. All right, we're going to come back after this break and talk with Jim Carafano about some of the innovations in national security policy in the Trump administration in just a moment. My guest today is James J. Carafano. Jim Carafano is Vice President of the Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation, the leading conservative think tank in Washington. An accomplished historian, expert on defense affairs, and 25-year veteran of the U.S. Army. Jim's most recent books include Surviving the End, which looks at emergency preparedness, and Wiki at War, a survey of the revolutionary impact of the internet age on national security. And in fact, I want to begin with that last reference to the internet age. I want to talk about a couple of innovations in American national security, and first begin with cybercom, cyber security, and the war in the cyberspace. Are we well prepared? Is America leading the world in this?
Well, boy, that's a very difficult question to answer, because just of the nature of modern technology and how quickly it accelerates and advances, when somebody says, are you safe? It's, well, even if you're like completely safe today, 5 minutes from now, there might be a new technology, a new software. So it's a competitive environment to exist in rather than essentially a problem to solve. It's not like I've put up a wall and I'm safe and there's more guys, okay, so my wall is 10 foot higher. This is an unending competition, so there is never a real answer to the question about, are you safe? I think, to the administration's credit, and I think this is kind of a natural evolution, I think we're all doing this, governments are paying increasingly more attention to competition in cyberspace and their responsibility. I think where there has been a big shift has been in the role of these very large tech companies with global reach, and where does their responsibility and interests lie in this. And this has been driven less by the administration's policy than by the reality of to companies like Google and Facebook, and how do I do business in this world? How do I bridge my business that I want to do in China and the United States. And I think increasingly a big recognition that the proliferation of technology can include significant security risks if the company proliferating that technology, as in the case of China, there's very little distinction between the company and the government using the company for defense and national security and economic warfare purposes. So it would be too much to credit to say, boy, these Trump guys really figured this out and they're on this. But I think the reality is not only would any American administration have kind of jumped on this as well, but I think globally we're seeing leaders all over the world grapple with exactly the same thing.
So let me ask you about a second arena, one that the Trump administration has grabbed on as a something that they want to own, it seems, and that's space.
Right.
Creation of the Space Command,
right.
Reinvigoration of America's role in space. Does this make sense? Why now? And are we doing it the right way?
Well, certainly it makes sense from a security perspective. There's a tremendous competition in space, particularly because of the rise of Chinese capabilities in space and Chinese capability to deny other people access to space. And space is simply vital for national security purposes in the world today. You cannot be a great power and not have full access to space. So, and the greatest threat to denying access to space is China. So that is inevitable. The second part of that, which is really kind of the public use of space exploration, those things, I think that's a little different. I think that would, if China had never risen, I think we would be in an age today where people were excited about going to Mars and going to the moon and other places. So it's not like the Cold War where what really jump-started the American space race was the fact that we were competing with the Russians, right? And then we kind of layered the trip to the moon on top of that. But even that we saw as part, even though we framed it as a civilian effort, it was really seen as a competition with the Russians. This is different. If China had never emerged as a major space threat, I think we would still be seeing this explosion in civilian space. And that's just because of the amazing advances, one in technology and two in the private commercial sector. You know, whereas in the 1960s, if the United States government wanted to go into space, it bore all the burden of developing the capability and the infrastructure to do that. Where today, we have private companies that have the ability on their own, without a government, to put assets in space. So if you partner that with a government that embraces the idea of space exploration, it's pretty powerful. So there's a lot of moving pieces going on.
So, one could say that how a country spends its money is a pretty accurate reflection of the priorities it puts on things. Doesn't always work that way, but it's a reasonable observation. When you look at American defense spending, do you think we have our priorities right? If there's something that you would fix, what would that be?
Well, I think this administration has invested more in defense. I still think we're actually underspending. One of the things that we do at the Heritage Foundation, which is publicly available online, is every year we do this index called the Index of U.S. Military Strength, where we objectively gauge the level of U.S. military capability in the same way every year, right? So you can have a kind of a trend line to see how you're doing. And we look at three factors. We looked at what are the capabilities of significant adversaries, obviously Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. What are the key areas of the world in which the United States would have to operate, principally Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific? And what are the capabilities that the U.S. military has, right? And we grade them, right? And despite the increased investments in the last few years, we have probably underinvested in defense for well over a decade. Doesn't mean we didn't spend a lot of money, because we spent a lot of money fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But in terms of investing in the military, we underinvested.
Jim Carafano, thank you very much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Dakhla, Washington.
Thank you.
The president was being clear. He says, I ran on this. We've been in wars for nearly 2 decades. This has exhausted us. It's exhausting the Middle East. A type of withdrawal that makes sense is on the horizon. Some of us, though, are working on other issues. For instance, I have a resolution about the Nineveh Plain and Sinjar that would call for an international training mission to create the conditions in which local religious minorities who were the victims of genocide would be integrated into the Iraqi central government security forces with some type of authority for their own security needs. So this is, for me, one way in which I can help create the conditions for the second phase after the American withdrawal so that, again, security is settled, people are protected, and Iraq particularly has a chance to flourish.
I have to apologize. In America's hyper-partisan political environment, when everything is either black or white, good or bad, righteous or evil, I see the world in shades of gray. I support candidates, not their party. I support policies, not ideologies. I support ideas, not dogmas. Don't get me wrong. I think political parties are important actors in our democracy, and I like seeing strong, engaged parties that channel the energy and enthusiasm of millions of supporters into practical political engagement. But I am not a fan of party over country, allegiance to party over the search for common ground. This celebration of the grayness of American politics applies to foreign policy too, including foreign policy toward the Middle East. Take Iran. 3 years ago, there was a real national debate over the Iran nuclear agreement, a deal which never received majority support from the US Congress. Today, because President Trump has withdrawn the United States from the agreement, and because everything he touches is holy grail for Republicans, but radioactive to Democrats, calling for America's return to the Iran nuclear deal is now official dogma for every potential Democratic presidential candidate, without debate and without looking at what we now know since the agreement was reached in 2015. Its advantages and disadvantages, especially what Democrats might demand of Iran if they're considering a return to the agreement someday, deserve a serious, fresh look. So too America's relationship with Saudi Arabia. One of President Trump's first initiatives was to re-energize relations with Riyadh and other Sunni Arab states. After several years in which they believed Washington was more interested in outreach to Tehran than strengthening partnership with them. Now, because of the horror of the Khashoggi affair and anguish over the Yemen misadventure, many in Washington are targeting the fundamentals of the US-Saudi relationship. Indeed, we are now perhaps facing the deepest crisis in US-Saudi relations in history, as bad as they were in the wake of the September 11th attack. Perhaps even worse than that, because no one then accused the Saudi leadership of consciously and purposefully conspiring in acts of murder, which is the case today. To the extent this crisis is a stalking horse for political conflict between critics and supporters of the president, it deserves analysis and assessment on its own merits, not one colored by politics. The answer here will be gray and nuanced, not the black and white of brief television sound bites on cable news shows. Perhaps I'm calling for something that is just not possible in today's politics, a deliberative process of discussion, analysis, and thoughtful debate, where there is some reason on all sides, and the outcome is not all my preferences and none of yours. But, as the saying goes, hope springs eternal. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول الآثار العملية لسياسة أميركا أولا، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.